money to spend. Some of us were born for races to win. Some of us are aware that it's good for us to care. Some of us feel the icy wind, poverty blowing in the air. For those of us who simply like to socialize, for those of us who tend to sink underneath the people's cry, let me say to you, right on, right on, right on. Oh, oh, and I say, right on, right on, right on. For those of us who live where peace is great, for those of us who live where hatred is enslaved, alright. For those of us who live a life surrounded by good fortune and wealth, talk about it. For those of us who live a life, hey, enjoying ourselves. Those of us who got drowned in the sea, happiness. For the soul, it takes pride in its God and Himself, and everything else. Love, love is a thing. Love, love, sweet love, love, wonderful. Oh, true love, love for love, God. Someday I will face the light, and my darling, one more thing. If you let me, I will take you to live where love is free. Oh, baby, oh, people, people, people who love, it's alright. All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let's get some energy here. Good afternoon. With all that soul music playing, this is the blackest event that LBJ School has ever had in its 50-year history. With all that soul music playing, Marvin Gaye, Right On from 1971, the live Detroit mix. That's what was playing. And then Kamasi Washington, Leroy and Lanisha was playing. So you can't get blacker than that, Leroy and Lanisha. Very, very excited to be here this evening for this second William C. Powers Jr. Speaker Series. My name is Peniel Joseph, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy here at the LBJ School, and the Barbara Jordan Chair in Political Values and Ethics, and a professor of history here. And I'm really privileged and honored to be here to introduce President of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Sherrilyn Ifill. Really, this is one of my personal heroes. She is a civil rights activist. She's a legal scholar. She is really one of the heroes of the 21st century on behalf of voting rights, everything that the Lyndon Baines Johnson School stands for, civil rights, social justice, criminal justice reform, going into communities, whether they're in rural Alabama or Mississippi or Texas, to fight on behalf of not just voting rights in the abstract, but fair elections for county commissioner, for the water board, for sheriffs. This is where local politics happens. President Ifill talks about the NAACP Legal Defense Fund not as something that's organizing every 4 or 2 year election cycles, but every single year, every single day, because that's how we protect our democracy. She calls it democracy maintenance. And she's going to speak to us today about voting rights, civil rights, social justice, criminal justice reform, and really what are the prospects for social and political transformation in 2020. NAACP Legal Defense Fund is nonpartisan, so she's going to speak about this in a way that is not for any specific particular candidate or point of view, but that is factually and evidence-based. So they do believe in facts and evidence in the way in which we conceive of the world. So just very briefly, Sherrilyn Ifill is the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the nation's premier civil rights law organization fighting for racial justice and equality. The LDF was founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall, the legendary civil rights lawyer and later Supreme Court justice, and became a separate organization from the NAACP in 1957. The lawyers at the Legal Defense Fund were the architects of the legal strategy that led to the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education on May 17, 1954, widely regarded as the most transformative and monumental legal decision of the 20th century. President Ifill is the second woman to lead the organization. She has an undergraduate degree from Vassar, a law degree from NYU. For 20 years, she served on the faculty of the University of Maryland School of Law in Baltimore. She has honorary doctorates from New York University, Bard College, Fordham Law School, and CUNY Law School. In 2019, President Ifill was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's a legal scholar as well, the author of On the Courthouse Lawn, which is about lynching and the legacy of lynching in the United States. The 10th anniversary edition was just published with a preface by Brian Stevenson of the EJI, and the author of Just Mercy, and a new book talking about race and the criminal justice system in a conversation with Brian Stevenson and Loretta Lynch, the former Attorney General, and Anthony C. Thompson. Since 2013, Sherrilyn Ifill has been the president of the Legal Defense Fund as its 7th director counsel. In that role, she has increased the visibility and engagement of the organization in cutting edge and urgent civil rights issues while maintaining the organization's decades-long leadership fighting voter suppression, inequity in education, and racial discrimination in the application of the death penalty. At critical moments during national unrest following the killing of unarmed African Americans by law enforcement, President Ifill's voice and vision framed the issue of policing reform and urban deprivation with powerful clarity in media appearances and public discussions. You can follow her at @sifill_LDF. She has over 179,000 Twitter followers and a very powerful media presence. Her forceful and fact-based analysis of complex issues of racial justice has made her a sought-after speaker and strategist whose counsel is sought by government officials, civic and community leaders, and national civil rights colleagues. So without further ado, we are very proud, the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, to present Sherrilyn Ifill as the William C. Powers Jr. Speaker Series. Thank you.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. And yes, and thank you first to Professor Joseph for the invitation to be with you tonight. I'm really quite thrilled. I was just tweeting out before we started that your last speaker was Khalil Muhammad. Your next speaker is Skip Gates. And so I'm not really happy about being sandwiched between those two superstars. No pressure at all. But I'm really grateful for the invitation, and I thank all of the staff at the center, the supporters of the center, and all of you for coming out, on an evening when you could be doing other things. I'm always encouraged to see this at this particular moment that people do want to come out and talk about these critical issues that consume my every waking and often sleeping hour. I have said since November 2016 that it's really critical that we come out and see each other. We can get kind of caught up in our own spaces. We can get on social media. We can get lost in MSNBC. We can get lost in, NPR. And it's important that we come out and see that there are so many of us, more of us in this country, who want and share a vision of justice and equality and democracy. So I appreciate you. It's extremely encouraging to see you out here tonight. I asked Professor Joseph what he wanted me to talk about today, and he said, first and foremost, criminal justice, which is a subject I'm always keen to discuss. But at this particular moment in which we find ourselves in this country, I feel really compelled to talk about other matters as well that I regard as directly related and intertwined with criminal justice policy and practice. But it would be irresponsible of me to fail, especially before this audience and at this important institution, which is deeply concerned with government and leadership and public policy, to talk about the very real and present danger in which we find ourselves at this moment. I know that there are people who don't speak in those terms and maybe don't appreciate that I speak in those terms. I have decided I don't care because each of us will be each of us will be responsible for what we did and what we said in this moment. Um, and I take very seriously my obligation to speak what I believe is the truth. I have been an observer of politics and engaged with issues of race and civil rights since I was a little girl and saw that woman on my TV screen during the Watergate hearings, which were incredibly boring that summer. And then suddenly they were not boring. And a big part of it was, uh, I saw uh, someone I wanted to be reflected on television, which was not the norm at that time, at least in terms of what I wanted to be. I didn't want to be a movie star. I didn't want to be a singer. I wanted to be somebody who makes a difference. I wanted to be powerful. I wanted to exude a certain kind of power that comes from being truthful. And so I'm not going to give that up now. I'm going to continue to be truthful. And I think actually one of the reasons that we're in the moment that we're in is, I'm an optimist. I'm always optimistic. But sometimes I think we can carry that optimism to a place where we don't engage honestly with what we really see happening around us. And so I don't want to do that. A few years ago, I said that our democracy was at a crossroads. This was even during the Obama administration. We had a very full docket of civil rights cases then, which I like to remind people in case our memories have become clouded and we now look back with nostalgia and think that those days were Shangri-La or Brigadoon or whatever magical place appeals to you. We have been fighting a battle around civil rights for many decades, and that battle has been intense over the last 10 years. And a few years ago, I said that our democracy was at a crossroads. But that was then. I think we've long passed the crossroads. And we really are heading straight for a precipice. Below that precipice lays authoritarianism, the end of the rule of law, full on rollback of civil rights, of women's rights, of human rights, and even our conception of the importance of those things in our democracy. We're in a swiftly moving train towards that precipice. And some of us are wringing our hands and lamenting the speed of the train. Some of us repeatedly are doing the equivalent of asking the conductor if he would be so kind as to slow down the train and perhaps bring it to a halt. Some of us are engrossed in our favorite novels or books and haven't looked up to see how fast the train is moving. Still others are enjoying the view. There are some who believe that the precipice will be a good thing. They believe that although others may perish in the fall, they will survive. And at the bottom of the canyon, they believe they will still be in the first class car, however mangled and damaged it may be. And then there are those who have simply allowed themselves to be lulled to sleep by the movement of the train. So I want to talk today not only about criminal justice reform, but about the relationship between it and the state of our democracy, our deeply flawed, admittedly, but still valuable democracy, and the clear and present danger that I think we currently face. I want to talk about the role of our democratic institutions in hastening our fast trip towards that precipice. And I want to talk about what is worth saving and why none of us have the luxury of ignoring this moment. But first, I want to honor Professor Joseph's request, and I want to talk about criminal justice. Much has been made over the last few years about the term criminal justice reform. It's almost becoming a term of art. Um, but for about 10 years, and in no small measure due to the important work of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and several other circumstances, a consensus began to emerge that America's passionate commitment to incarceration could no longer be sustained. Libertarians decided that it was too expensive. Progressives, of course, wanted to address longstanding criminal justice policies that they believe are wrong. Civil rights advocates recognize that over incarceration is a child of unjust, racist policies and laws that allowed the increased strength of the prison system and the warehousing of human beings, 2.3 or 2.2 at this point, mostly men, mostly African American or Latino. And so, since that time, criminal justice reform has picked up speed as an idea, a concept, work, and we should acknowledge that there has been important development in that work. And I really have been impressed and excited about the diversity of approaches to this critical work and the very real way in which the narratives about crime and punishment, about formerly incarcerated persons, about drug crimes, about nonviolent drug crimes, about recidivism have unfolded and produced policies that are slowly, very slowly, producing some important reforms that we're seeing around the country. But I truly believe that because of many of those reforms, we've now reached the point of confronting the truly difficult and hugely important aspects of criminal justice reform that will reveal whether we are playing some rhetorical game or whether we're truly committed as a society to getting our hands around the role that our criminal justice system has played in perpetuating racism and racist stereotypes, in breaking men and women and children, in dismantling communities and enriching corporations, and in weakening our democracy and in hardening the soul of this nation. Some of what we have done in the criminal justice space has actually prepared us to accept some of the cruelty that we see at this moment. So I think we're now at the point where we really must confront some of the most difficult questions in trying to do this work. Because after all, there's been a great deal of tinkering around the edges, but now we have to deal with the hard stuff. It's one thing to talk about reducing incarceration rates for nonviolent drug offenders. That's important. But it's another to talk about reducing incarceration rates for even violent offenders. It's one thing to talk about legalizing marijuana, another to talk about how we deal with the many people whose lives were broken by the harsh criminal laws surrounding marijuana that set so many people's life on a course from which they cannot return. To compelling communities to accept drug treatment facilities in their neighborhoods, that's hard stuff. It's one thing to talk about education for juveniles in juvenile jails. It's another to talk about how we provide adequate education to children so that they never encounter the criminal justice system. It's one thing to support prison ministries, quite another to talk about infusing our entire criminal justice system with a true commitment to redemption, with non negotiable humane treatment for everyone who we hold, and with the end of prolonged solitary confinement, with potable water and decent food for those who are incarcerated. It's one thing to talk about reentry, and for years I taught a reentry clinic at University of Maryland Law School. But it's one thing to talk about reentry and another to talk about ensuring that prisoners are located in facilities close to their families so they can retain those ties, which have been documented as critical to successful reentry. It's one thing to talk about the exorbitant rate of to talk about reentry, but another to talk about the exorbitant rate of phone calls that prevent prisoners from staying in ready touch with family and connecting with their loved ones. It's a whole nother thing to create a more human system of visits that facilitates family being able to remain connected. It's one thing to talk about former inmates returning to responsible citizenship. It's another thing to ensure that they can exercise the most important and identifiable mark of citizenship in our country, voting. It's one thing to talk about reducing mass incarceration, and another to talk about decriminalizing low level offenses, ending cash bail, ending mandatory minimums. This is the really hard stuff. So I want to, on one hand, acknowledge that there has been success, but also suggest that now we're starting to hit the tough stuff. As we say in our office, we see all the time on the front pages of newspapers these tragic stories of individuals who are wrongly incarcerated, innocent men and women who were imprisoned for crimes that they did not commit. But we also have to have a conversation about the guilty and whether we believe that they too are human beings, entitled to be treated as human beings. So it's one thing to talk about progressive prosecutors, which is a great thing, who will prosecute police misconduct and brutality. But it's another to have progressive prosecutors who will also abide by Batson, the Supreme Court decision that prevents litigants from deliberately keeping Black people off of juries, a practice that's routine in many prosecutors' offices. Or to abide by the Brady versus Maryland decision, in which the Supreme Court required prosecutors to provide voluntarily exculpatory evidence to the defense. It's a decision that dates back to the 1960s and yet also is routinely not adhered to by prosecutors. It's one thing to talk about criminal justice reform, but another to recognize that policing reform lies at the core of that work. So we're now at the point when, if we are to really talk about advancing criminal justice reform, we must ready ourselves to do the hard work of addressing the hardest parts of an incredibly difficult problem. And we come to the moment of doing this work at precisely the time when the levers for potential democratic engagement and change in our country are being weakened and dismantled. We come to this moment at precisely the moment when the courts are being filled with judges who are unlikely to have the courage, the vision, or the experience to undertake the necessary role that the courts must play in addressing embedded injustice that has helped to create the current system. We come to this work at the moment when the United States Congress has become paralyzed by partisan politics and by too many who value power above all else. We come to this necessary work at precisely the moment when the will of the people at the ballot box is frustrated by obscene gerrymandering and voter suppression and Russian interference and Facebook misinformation. We come to this work precisely at the moment when the greatest bully pulpit in the world is controlled by a president who encourages police misconduct. Remember, don't be too nice when you put them in what he called the paddy wagon. A president who bullied one of the most profitable corporations in the world, the National Football Association, to further its shameful treatment against a talented, decent, upright young man who silently protested police violence against unarmed African Americans. A president whose Department of Justice has abandoned pattern and practice investigations of police departments engaged in unconstitutional policing, and whose Attorney General now regularly publicly uses his platform to disparage the reform efforts of the handful of progressive prosecutors who have been elected in states across the country and who seek to make real change. A president who has mixed to perfection the devastating cocktail of racism, lawless police action, and defiance of federal courts, and poured it to the brim for the consumption of his followers when he used his presidential power to pardon Sheriff Joe Arpaio, a law enforcement officer who racially profiled immigrants and who boasted that he was running a concentration camp for undocumented immigrants, and who defied a court order to stop his discriminatory practices and thus was held in criminal contempt. And the president pardoned him and called him a great patriot. We arrive at this moment when we must tackle the tangled roots of racism and profit and the spirit of cruelty and vengeance that has undergirded our criminal justice practices for so long, at precisely a time when the prevailing winds are against us. Well, one of the truths of being a civil rights lawyer is that you learn, despite all your planning and strategizing and care. There's never a right time, or at least you learn that you're not fully in control of the array of forces that make a moment the right time for transformation. I spend a lot of time reading about LDF history in particular, in part because the creation of LDF and some of its greatest successes are evidence of precisely this. I think sometimes about even the formation of LDF in 1940. We take it for granted, but it was quite a thing to incorporate an organization of Black lawyers in 1940. It was quite an extraordinary thing to assemble a staff of Black lawyers and Jewish lawyers like Jack Greenberg, who went on to become our second director counsel, and women like Constance Baker Motley. This was an extraordinary thing that was done. And there were certainly no signs in 1940 that this was the moment. I think sometimes about the period after the war, 1945, 1948 or 49, when Marshall started winning cases like Sweat versus Painter in 1950 and like Sipawell versus Fisher in 1949, when it started to look like something might change. But I'm so interested in the years before it started to look like something might change. Um, it was improbable, frankly, that the end of legal segregation, at least in education, was at hand. Yes, America had fought and helped win World War II, and African American soldiers who fought in the war came home with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity about the demand to be treated as equal citizens. But the response to that demand was, as it had been after World War I, quite savage. White Southerners were determined to put Blacks back in their place. Isaac Woodard returned back to the U.S. in 1946, a Black man, a decorated sergeant in the United States Army, and he boarded a Greyhound bus in Augusta, Georgia, on his way back home to Aiken, South Carolina. And after a verbal exchange with the bus driver, in which he was asking if the driver would stop because he needed to use the restroom, he was ordered off the bus at the next stop by a sheriff in Batesburg, South Carolina, who deemed Sergeant Woodard insufficiently respectful and beat Woodard in both eyes with the butt of his nightstick until Woodard passed out. And when he regained consciousness in jail where he had been charged with disorderly conduct, he could no longer see, and he would never see again. And LDF represented Isaac Woodard. In 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney was executed in Clarendon County, South Carolina, for 2 murders he didn't commit. Recently, he was cleared of those murders, and you may have seen pictures of that little boy who looks about 8 in the striped prison costume who was executed. There were 6 lynchings in the South in 1946, and a particularly brutal lynching in Greenville, South Carolina in 1947. Right here in Texas, after the Black high school burned down in Hearne, Texas in 1947, the school commissioner promised that they would build a new Black high school. And instead, they pulled together 2 barracks and brought them across town to the Black community and said, "This is your new high school." The barracks had housed German prisoners of war. And Black parents rebelled. They boycotted school for the first few weeks of the school year. And they sent frantic telegrams to Thurgood Marshall, who was then litigating Ada Sipawell's case, which ultimately ended segregation at the University of Oklahoma Law School. He was litigating a case called Elmore versus Rice in South Carolina, in which South Carolina was refusing to abide by an earlier win in a case he'd had challenging all-white primary elections that were held by the Democratic Party. He was already representing uh, plaintiffs in the case challenging the exclusion of Blacks from the University of Texas Law School. He was doing all of that, and then he had to go to Hearne, Texas, and address this issue of the prisoner of war barracks that Black parents refused to accept for their children. He had won Smith versus Allwright in 1944. That's the case I was referring to, the all white Democratic primary case. Then he had to get over to South Carolina to litigate Elmore versus Rice. You win the Supreme Court case, but states refused to adhere to it. And so you had to then go to the different states and challenge that again, even though you had won the Supreme Court case. And so he had to challenge it in South Carolina, where the governor of South Carolina had declared that we will do everything we can to maintain white supremacy. Those were his exact words. In short, there was very little in this period to suggest that in just a few years the Supreme Court would decide Brown versus Board of Education and end segregation in education, and that within 20 years a civil rights movement would have transformed the direction of American democracy and the lives of everyone sitting in this room. There were just no signs of it. So there's no right time. Indeed, these very challenging and frightening times only call us to be more focused, more strategic, more determined to find a path to keep pushing the needle of equality and justice forward. So, how, for example, do we engage this moment in an area like criminal justice reform? Well, we've been thinking and talking about this a great deal over the last few years. We kind of knew this was coming. Frankly, once President elect Trump announced that he planned to appoint Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, we pretty much knew what was going to happen. We knew Jeff Sessions well. When he was U.S. Attorney in Alabama, had prosecuted several of our clients who were colleagues of Dr. King. He prosecuted them in 1984 and 85 on trumped up voter fraud charges, so that you know this voter fraud thing has been going on for a while. And we represented the Perry County Three, as they were known. One of the lawyers on that team who represented them and was able to exonerate them was Deval Patrick, by the way, who was a lawyer at LDF for a number of years, and later became Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Department of Justice. I always feel like I have to say it because somehow that's not part of his resume. And um, I always feel it's important to credit people who began and got their base and roots in the practice of civil rights law. So we knew that Jeff Sessions meant the federal. He ended the Smart on Crime initiative that had been started by Attorney General Eric Holder, and instructed all of his U.S. attorneys to charge people to the fullest. Just one of the ways that people get huge sentences because they are charged with every aspect of a crime stacked on top of one another. He doesn't believe in consent decrees, and so he was very clear that the department would not be focused on pattern and practice investigations of police departments anymore. They might prosecute individual officers, but they would not do the kind of systemic review and then prosecution and then consent decree and monitoring process that the Attorney General's office had done earlier that resulted in the consent decrees in Ferguson and in Baltimore and Seattle and Newark and Camden and Cincinnati and many other places. So we knew that was off the table. And so we began to strategize about what we would do. One of the decisions we made pretty early on is that we would devolve a great deal of our work to the local. We recognized we wouldn't have a federal partner. And what we described it as we would have to become a private Department of Justice. And so in both the criminal justice field and in the voting field, we really pulled our resources down to the local level. We brought more organizers on our staff so that we would have that connection and hear from the communities that we were representing, especially because we feel there's tremendous power in the movements that have been developing in the post-Ferguson period, whether we're talking about the movements against police violence, the movement for Black Lives, the Parkland young people, the Women's March. We're in a movement time. And I was sharing with Professor Joseph earlier, that's when the most civil rights progress happens, when the lawyering meets up with the movement time. There is an energy and a force that moves things forward. So we had to make those decisions. But more recently, I've been talking with leaders of other civil rights organizations about what I regard as the human rights crisis unfolding in Southern prisons. And I don't know if you all have been reading about this or paying attention to it. You may have read about what's been happening in the Alabama prisons. South Carolina, Mississippi in particular, where there have been 15 or so deaths just over the last few months. If you've read any of those accounts, and I really encourage you to do so, I want to credit the local reporters in Alabama and South Carolina who are reporting on this, on these conditions. It is beyond what you can even wrap your brain around. It's like something out of a horror story. Uh, the levels of inattention, of violence, the inhumane conditions, the lack of hygiene. Um, it's a crisis, and so we've been talking about how to deal with it. And it reminded me that of the words, in fact, of the federal district judge for the Southern District of Texas, who granted a preliminary injunction in 2007 in a case filed by the Texas Civil Rights Project on behalf of inmates from the Wallace Pack Unit prison, who sued prison officials for violations of their Eighth Amendment rights because of the heat conditions in the prisons and the heat index that, when it goes above 100 degrees, it's quite dangerous to life and health. And on page 100 of Judge Ellison's exhaustive decision, he quoted Fyodor Dostoevsky, who said in his book, The House of the Dead, the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. And it was confirmation for me, remembering those words, that this is the time to push on real criminal justice reform. That actually what we do in the space of criminal justice reflects where we are as a society and who we are. And so, one of the hard things we will have to confront is the way in which we have, in a cowardly fashion, turned away from solving some of the most difficult problems in our society. And instead, we have pushed them into the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system constitutes a massive investment that we have made as a society. And we're always making investments. So, problems of poverty, mental health care, jobs, young people, our education system. We have actually invested in all of those things to the billions of dollars, except we put it in the criminal justice system. That's where we chose to shunt all those problems, to put money, to push them to a place where we don't have to see it. And since we believed that the effect of this would mostly fall on Black and Brown people, it could be done. So, one way to think about criminal justice reform is about reimagining investments and where we choose to invest those dollars. That's a hard conversation to have, but a necessary one. We have now created a landscape in our criminal justice system, an architecture of prisons, an architecture in our courts. Think about what it takes to get to mass incarceration, to what it gets to 2.3 million people being held. You need more courtrooms, more judges, more jails, more police. You need all of that. And we've invested in all of that. We didn't invest in better and more schools, programs for young people, real job training, reimagining how to make our economy work for working class people, racism. We decided not to do any of the hard stuff and instead to do this other thing. So when we start talking about criminal justice reform, usually people raise to me the First Step Act, which was a first step. I call it a baby step, but every step is important. And I certainly always support helping people who have served too long in prison to get out. That's important, just on a human being basis. But it is still, nevertheless, a small part of a vast problem. First of all, it is focused just on the federal system, and you know that the federal system is a small part of our larger criminal justice system, which is largely at the state and local level. Um, And because the First Step Act is focused mostly on conditions within prison, one of the most important pieces is a ban on shackling pregnant women when they are giving birth in the federal system, and ending some forms of solitary for juveniles, and of course, obviously, creating a system in which prisoners can accumulate good time credits and get out earlier. We pushed. We actually did not support the bill on the House side because it did not include uh, anything that would address how people get in the system. And I really credit Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Cory Booker, who really pushed on the Senate side to make sure that mandatory minimums were a part of that First Step Act. Addressing mandatory minimums were a part of that First Step Act also, but it's still a small step. I really believe the key is to shut off the faucet that forces people into the system. And that means school suspensions, charging juveniles as adults, racial profiling and policing, overcharging arrestees, bail reform, access to lawyers and public defenders, ending mandatory minimums, sentencing reform, drug courts, drug treatment, diversion programs, and so on, and so on, and so on. And this work is local and intense, and it's very resource heavy. It takes a lot to implement these efforts. A lot of the criminal justice work we do at LDF and other really excellent civil rights organizations are focused on these areas. In particular, at LDF, we're focused in our criminal justice work not only on young people, but we're specifically focused on systemic practices that touch emerging adults, those who are between 18 and 25. For African Americans, this is the population about whom many of the most pernicious stereotypes in the criminal justice system are created. They are the people that many people are afraid of. And they're not children, so they don't get the benefit of being children. For those of us who are of a certain age and have children who are between those ages, we tend not to think of them as being fully developed adults. We tend to think that they need our help and our support. We think that about our own 22-year-old children, but we don't think that about 22-year-old young men in Baltimore who were arrested for a crime, violent or nonviolent, and who don't have those resources. This work, of course, would be much easier if we had a federal partner. The money wielded by the federal government alone is one of the most persuasive forces to move change at the local level. Those of us who were bused to integrated schools, as I was in Queens, New York, most of the integration that happened in the North happened after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that includes a nice little provision called Title VI, which provides that federal funds cannot be provided to programs that engage in discrimination. And the fear of the loss of federal funds by northern school districts is what actually pushed most of the integration efforts and busing that happened where it happened for the brief period of about 10 years that it did happen. So when people, eschew the importance of the federal government, that money is very, very persuasive. And the federal government's involvement ensures that that change can happen across jurisdictions and across states. They just have vast power. And so now we're left to do the local work painstakingly and carefully and much more slowly. But that's what we must do. That's what we're called to do at this time. It's also critical that we support activism and movements, as I suggested earlier, that we put information in the hands of average people, that we protect the vote, which is the critical avenue to local power, and that we pressure state and local governments with litigation, and for those who can, lobbying and plain old grassroots pressure. I like to use stop and frisk as the example of what can happen. LDF was part of the team of litigators who challenged New York City's stop and frisk practice. And I would say the first success of the work is that when I say stop and frisk, you know what I'm talking about, and you are not in New York. It was a campaign that included tremendous grassroots organization and activism, that included strategic communications, amazing stories, narratives, films, op-eds by young men who were stopped 20, 30 times in the course of a few years and what it meant to them. And it involved litigation. Organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights, NLDF. The result of it is that we were successful largely in that litigation. There was a settlement, and we're still involved in monitoring that settlement. But people right away understand the concept of what we're talking about. This is a reality that African American and Latino New Yorkers lived with for years, but it was through the work of this campaign that it got a name that allowed people from other communities to say, oh, yeah, that happens to us too. Yeah, we know what that is, and we know what the effect of it is, and it can be discussed at presidential debates. We have to recognize that those are victories also when we put a name to the phenomenon that those who are the most marginalized have had to deal with. And so we still have that power to do that local work that ultimately ends up percolating up and produces the opportunity for us to connect across jurisdictions in that struggle. And so we're thinking this through now and continuing to do that work. I also use, the example of voter suppression, which now is a term of art and people know exactly what we're talking about. I joined LDF in 1988 as a voting rights attorney. I've been litigating voting rights cases for 30 years. In 1988, no one would have known what that term meant. Shouldn't say no one, but many people would not have. But it has entered the mainstream as a result of the work, and it has put people on high alert for what it means in terms of political power in this country. So in closing, I don't want to and will not minimize the challenge I think we face at this moment in our democracy and what it will mean if we go over that precipice for those who are most vulnerable. It's difficult to even wrap our minds around it. But I do want to emphasize that we are not without power. It begins with the power closest to us, which is local power. We have the power of truth. We have the power of our stories. We have the power of the history of those who came before us, who created out of their own determination a plan to create a room that looks like this room in Texas today. It isn't that Thurgood Marshall or Robert Carter or Franklin Williams had a blueprint of what it might look like to have an America in which there was not legally enforced racial discrimination. They weren't operating from a blueprint of a country that existed anywhere in the world where there was a multiracial democracy. But they were determined to make the words of the Constitution be true for us. And they walked that path despite the fact that there were no signs that they could succeed. So I think it's important that we see that power, that we speak our stories. As civil rights lawyers, I used to tell my students, our job is to create the platform on which our clients can amplify their voices. And there's a special power that happens, I can tell you, in a courtroom, regardless of the outcome of the case, when their voices come forth and they say the truth of their experience. And there is a special power in fighting for just causes. I will not ever stop fighting for just causes. And when we fight for those causes, we're sometimes digging deep and planting seeds and preparing ourselves for, as we say in the church, when our change comes. It always does come. The key is, will we be ready? Will we have laid the foundation? Will we have planted seeds? Will we have developed a strategy that will allow us to push at that critical moment and produce the kind of transformation that happened with Brown versus Board of Education? There were no signs, and then it was the moment. But they continued the work even through the most difficult times, even through the lynching, even through the discrimination, even through the voter suppression. And then when it was their moment, it was their moment. So I encourage you all to keep fighting, come out and see each other, and let's prepare for when our change comes. Thank you.
Yes. Are you good? Okay. All right. Thank you. I want to give another round of applause. This is, I want to, I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit to the second part of that equation in terms of voting rights. This is a 2020 national election. It's a presidential election. Uh, I really want to talk about uh, the work you're doing on behalf of voting rights, just organizationally. This is going to be the 55th anniversary of Selma and the beatings at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Uh, President Johnson on March 15th, 1965, has the "We Shall Overcome" speech, dignity of man, destiny of democracy. Voting Rights Act, August 6th, 1965. So I want to talk about, in really a substantive way, what is the NAACP Legal Defense Fund doing to both protect and really create a world where voting rights really flourish here?
Yeah. So, can you hear me? You can. Okay, great. So first and foremost, I was sharing with you, Penio, earlier that I sometimes think because of the majesty of the civil rights movement for voting rights that resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Selma to Montgomery March, Bloody Sunday, the beating on that bridge, and so forth, um, that we have, yeah, and I think it's Cornell Brooks who calls voting a kind of civil sacrament of our democracy. And I love that. It's beautiful. But the people who were engaged in that struggle, who risked their lives, who were beaten, the Fannie Lou Hamers and people who lost their lives, the Jimmy Lee Jacksons and others, believed that voting power would give African Americans the opportunity to transform the material conditions of their lives and their communities. It wasn't just symbolic, right? It was actually about obtaining the power to be able to create that transformation. So I want to say that at the outset because that's how we think about voting, right? We're not just talking about something symbolic. We absolutely believe it's a powerful expression of citizenship, um, and critical for that reason. But it's also critical because the point is to place the tool, the democratic tool, in the hands of people to allow them to have a role in transforming their community. So we start with that vision. And because of that, as I shared with you, we actually don't go from presidential election to presidential election. We always say elections happen every year. So we do election protection work every year. We're on the ground in at least 8 states on election day, primary and general, to do election protection work. Now, we do this because obviously the core of our voting rights work is litigation. Yes. And we're litigating year round, challenging practices that violate the Voting Rights Act, challenging intentional discrimination. We were on the team that successfully challenged Texas's voter ID law. We participated in that trial. We did the closing argument. We argued the case on appeal. So that's what we do. Okay. So that's the year round grind of the work of just dealing with voter suppression policies and challenging them in court and litigating. But we also know that voter suppression happens on election day. Yes. And of course, we participate with other civil rights groups in the election protection hotline, which should be in your phone, 866 Our Vote, so that people can call in when they're having issues or see problems happening at the polls. But we also know that it's critical that you be on the ground. And so we knew that we had to ramp up that practice. The 2016 presidential election was the first presidential election since 1964 without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act.
And this is because of Shelby v.
And that's because of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which removed what is known as pre-clearance, in which certain jurisdictions, mostly in the South, but not exclusively, before they could make any voting change, had to get permission from the Attorney General or from a federal district court in DC. Texas, for example, that same voter ID law, Texas had tried to implement that voter ID law before 2013 and could not get it pre-cleared. And I remember I was outside the Supreme Court decision came down. And I think I mentioned to you that Attorney General Holder had reached out to the civil rights leaders and asked us to come to the Justice Department and meet with him to talk about the effect of the decision. And we were on our way over to the department, and I think we just got there. We're all sitting around Robert Kennedy's table, and Attorney General Holder is pledging that the resources of the Department of Justice, will be used to protect against voting discrimination. And we see the tweet from your then Attorney General who said, we're ready to implement that voter ID law. That was 2 hours after the decision, and he was ready. The Secretary of State of Florida said, we're free and clear now. So we knew what that meant. And we knew that we didn't have preclearance. And preclearance allowed you, the reason the Voting Rights Act has been called the crown jewel of all of the civil rights statutes. And that provision has been regarded as the most successful provision of any voting rights statute, is because it's the only one that allows you to head discrimination off at the pass. It allows you to get it before it's implemented. Without it, just as happened here, sure, we won the Texas voter ID case. But as we proved at trial, 600,000 people were prevented from being able to vote. That's the population of Baltimore. Were prevented from being able to vote in Texas as a result of that law. And while the pendency of that law was happening, you all were electing county commissioners and members of your assembly and district attorneys and all these local races that are so powerful in your lives, and that is a part of this local power apparatus that I was just talking about.
And I want you to get deeper into that, because you've talked about everything from Prairie View A&M and Waller County and the suits that the NAACP has filed against them. What are you doing at that granular level, not just in Texas, but Alabama, and you talked about rural counties?
I'm just a strong advocate of focusing on local elections, because I really believe that political power gets built from the ground up. And because many, many years ago, when I first started out, our clients told us that these were the people who controlled their lives. I mean, the president's all fine and good and important, powerfully important. The governor is powerfully important. The senator is powerfully important. But on a day-to-day basis, the person who's going to arrest their son, the person who's going to decide to engage with ICE, the sheriff, the person who's going to make the decision about whether you get bail or not, that these are the local actors who are in their community. So we've tried to focus on that work. The examples are things like Waller County, Texas. We represented students at Prairie View A&M in the 1990s when they refused to have polling for students on the campus. And for those, you all know, Prairie View is a historically Black college here in your state. This past election, 2018, Waller County had early voting, but they had early voting for a certain number of hours across the county, except for Prairie View, which had diminished early voting hours. So we had to sue once again Waller County. And actually, I think now Waller County the answer is they have now just eliminated early voting. So we have to go back and deal with that. In Alabama, we were there on election day in 2018. Students at Alabama A&M, another historically Black college, were so excited about the election. Remember, 2018 was a midterm, but it was a lot of excitement about the election, and they all registered to vote. And they get to the polling place, and they're not on the rolls; they're on the inactive list. So we had to deal with that issue. Interestingly, the next day they were on the active list, and so we had to file suit within days to try to address that issue. So it's like up to the minute. We're doing a little march through towns in Alabama. I don't talk about it that much, but Pleasant Grove and Madison County and looking at school boards and county commissions and those places where people don't pay a lot of attention to it. One of the keys for us is you pointed out at the top that LDF is a nonpartisan organization. So what that means is, for example, I spent the election day, November 2016, the presidential election, in Alabama. And so people would doing poll watching, and people would say, well, why weren't you in Michigan or Wisconsin? I said, well, we don't do swing states. That's not we don't work for a party. Black people in Alabama also are entitled to be able to participate in the political process. So most of 90% of our cases are in the South, and that's because most Black people still live in the South. I think people don't know that, but that's true. We do work in Baltimore and Detroit, and just filed a case in Cleveland, but mostly we do our work in the South. And so that means we're in Alabama and we're in Florida. We're part of the team trying to get the voting rights restored to formerly incarcerated folks in Florida. There was a good victory the other day for our clients, but we want it for all of that entire population of 1.4 million people to be able to have their vote restored. So it's really work focused on the South. It's making sure that we focus on local communities. It's having the litigation piece on point, but it's also being there to do the granular work of being there when they change polling places, of being in Richland County, South Carolina, when voters are coming out and saying I'm voting, but the machine is switching my vote from Democrat to Republican. That's our job on election day, to then get to the county commission to tell them, who, by the way, the county election board was very happy to have us. They knew that there was a problem, and throughout the night they wanted us to tell them which polling places. They were sending out technicians. The issue, frankly, was that there weren't enough technicians to actually fix machines. There were like 2 technicians for 150 polling places. So but you got to be there, right, to get that work done on that day.
And the 2 technicians, President Ifill, when you talk about the resources that we have in this country for voting, one, I want to talk about that. But then 2, what can we all do? We're here at a policy school. I think there's going to be so many students. We have some UT Black law students here, including students who just got into UT, but L1 and L2s as well. What can we do? Because we brought people here like Ari Berman, who's written about voting rights, beautiful book. Carol Anderson's, One Person, No Vote. She's brilliant. But you're doing the work. You're not just documenting, and that's why you're here. And so, what can we do? One, I love that you're sharing your narrative with us, because one of the things I always argue is that we need to change the narrative, and you say that too. You, Brian Stevenson,
all important.
One, you're changing the narrative that voting rights is not just about the heroic period of the civil rights movement with Dr. King. It's now. So if everybody, one thing that's been going online is that a big meme that whatever you might have thought you were doing during the civil rights movement or during the women's right or whatever in the past, you're doing it right now.
That's right.
Because this is real for all of us.
You know how we all believe we all would have been marching and everything? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Like when I was in South Africa in the 1990s and everyone was in the anti-apartheid movement.
Yes.
Yeah. It was the 1% of the 1%. Just always remember that. People who were active in the civil rights movement were the 1% of the 1%. Wasn't a majority of people, wasn't even a majority of Black people.
Yes. And you talk about this in your book. You say that what the civil rights movement's heroic period did, and Black Power, is provide the nation with what you call an equity dividend.
Yes.
And I want you to talk about that equity.
We've never asked to be paid for it.
Yeah. And what is that equity dividend?
Well, what I mean is, the narrative about this country, which is a powerful one, was really created out of the people who struggled against injustice and how we then responded to that. So thinking about it, America, which many people around the world do, or at least did, as a place of equality and justice and opportunity, which I think that's how we think about the country, I think. If you're a business leader and you go abroad to do business, you carry with you the imprimatur of being an American, which is not just that your country has a lot of money and has nuclear weapons, but is that you represent this thing, this concept, right?
Liberty's surest guardian.
And that largely came out of what was powerful was that a small band of people, right, who could have been wiped out entirely if you were a different kind of country, right, demanded their rights. And they were able to push and transform the country, not saying it was perfect afterwards, but fundamentally. That it could be that Sunday night, CBS could be showing Judgment at Nuremberg on TV for the first time, and people could be watching and seeing what happened in Nazi Germany and having that interruption of breaking news, which happens now every second. But in those days, breaking news was really breaking news.
Yes.
And what the breaking news was what was happening on the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
1965.
And that Americans could be watching that movie and saying, is this us? Is that who we are? Right? That created a narrative that we all share and have advanced, no matter how cynical we are. We all think that.
Yes, you're right.
And we treat it instead like it's something over here. When we talk about civil rights, people think it's something over here for Black people, when in fact, we bettered this entire country, made this country able to look at itself with decency. What you could say about this country as a place of equality and opportunity and justice came out of the sacrifices of those people. And you benefit from it, whether you are white or whether you are Black, whether you are a business person or a civil rights lawyer. You benefit because the country that cloaks you, your blue passport, means that you're from a country that's about something decent. That's what it's supposed to mean.
Yeah.
Right?
No, it's true. It's true.
So,
Yeah. And
so
you call it an equity dividend. It's also a moral dividend.
It's a moral dividend. And we all benefit from it. And the reason I called it a dividend is because we've never attached a dollar figure to it, but it actually benefits us, right? It allowed us to walk with a certain moral authority in the world, and our leaders to walk with a certain moral authority in the world. And instead we treat it like nothing, not as though we gave a gift to this country that bettered and elevated us. And it's why I'm so unapologetic of talking about civil rights work as democracy work. Frankly, if the cautions we had been raising had been listened to, I had been saying that when the Texas voter ID law was passed and when we proved that it was created for the purpose, this is what the judge found in her 94-page decision, the purpose of discriminating against African American and Latino voters. When the North Carolina omnibus voter suppression bill was passed and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals found that it was created with surgical precision to discriminate against African American voters. When in Wisconsin, they created a voter ID law that the federal court found was created for the purpose of discriminating against African American, I called it an effort to maintain white supremacy. But people were not ready to talk about white supremacy until they saw people with khaki pants walking with tiki torches in Charlottesville. White supremacy is not just Nazi flags, right? It's white people deciding, I will do whatever to hold on to power. I don't know what else it would be. That's what the governor of Mississippi was saying when he said, we're going to keep the white primary going, right? So actually, if people were listening to the warning signs that people who do the work of civil rights, we're telling you what is broken in the democracy that needs to be fixed.
And so what can we do?
What can we do?
What can we do?
Yes. So glad you asked.
Yes.
So first of all, it's really important that we understand it's not just about the vote.
Okay.
I do encourage people to follow me on Twitter or to follow the Legal Defense Fund on Twitter. And I want to emphasize again, the Legal Defense Fund is a different organization from the NAACP. We've been entirely separate since 1957. And so when you're looking for us, just know that we're not the NAACP. So part of what we're posting, and today we actually posted for Texas, we have kind of palm cards that tell you everything you need to know about when to register, when cutoff periods are, what your rights are around voting, and so forth. And you can find it, and we want you to have it, and we want you to share it with people because we want people to know exactly what they're doing. I encourage everyone, if you're sitting in this room, most likely you're registered to vote. If you're not registered to vote, you'll be so ashamed that you'll be registered tomorrow. But I'm assuming that you are, and I am assuming that you are going to vote. And I encourage people who are in that position to think about voting early if there is early voting and you can, so that on election day, you can help other people to the polls, right? Your job is not just to vote. Your job is to vote, get out of the way, get yourself out of the way. You shouldn't be in the line, the long line, right? You should be driving the car where you picked up some people and you're not, remember, in the car, you're not telling them who to vote for. Don't get in any trouble, but you're helping people. You're facilitating others who may have difficulty getting to the polls and back. And you're taking some time off that day to do it. It's not just about voting. Okay, so let's just first talk about what happens on that day when you vote, if you early vote, if you vote absentee. I want us, those of us who are passionate voters, to be honest. You don't vote in every election. You don't vote for every office. And if you vote for every office, you don't know who you're voting for some of the time. So one of the things we do is that we leave most of our local power on the table, right? If we look at a typical ballot and we look at the outcome of an election, we'll see that you voted for the president if the president is running. If not the president, you voted for the governor. You voted for the senator. You often vote for your mayor. Sometimes you vote for your county council person. Then it says, pick 3 judges. You may pick 3, but maybe you pick 3 because I don't know. I don't know
Their,
why you picked
their
them.
names
Their
maybe have.
name, maybe you think they're a particular ethnicity or
Mhm.
you think they're a particular party. You've got county commissioners, you've got the railroad commissioner. I seen your ballot. You have all these different offices. When I first was a voting rights lawyer at the Legal Defense Fund, one of the cases I did was a case challenging the way justices of the peace and constables are elected in Galveston County.
Mm.
And when the case first came to me, I just didn't see the issue because I thought justice of the peace. If we're New Yorkers,
Yeah.
I watched a lot of movies on TV as a kid, and I thought the justices of the peace were the nice people who married you if you eloped. Remember those movies? You would go to the
Yeah.
justice of the peace. So I didn't get it. I was like, who cares? I mean, it's the person marries you or not. But I didn't know they had ticketing power, but and certain kinds of judicial and police power that's important. So I really want to encourage you, and I've seen your ballot. You've got like 4 elections this year. You got a lot of elections. You got the one
yes.
next week, and then you have another one, and then
Early
you have,
voting is already started.
you've got a lot going on. So I get it, and I know it's a lot of work, and maybe you can't do it for everyone. But I want to ask you to pick one election that you don't know the people who are running for that office, and this time, educate yourself about those. Go to the League of Women Voters site,
Yes.
educate yourself about who
Yeah.
those people are.
Yeah.
One more thing, I know we're running out of time, but it's very important. It doesn't end there. Remember, I talked about the transformation into political power so that you could transform your community, which means that after you finish voting for your state school board members, and you are voting for your state school board, you're voting for all the members of your general assembly or whatever, not the senators, the what do you call them? Yeah, your state legislators. You're voting.
House of Representatives. Yeah.
That's it. You're voting for all of them this time. That's huge. That's huge, right? You're voting for all your district attorneys, I think, as well.
Yeah.
You're voting for the sheriff. The sheriff's going to decide whether they hook up with ICE and start. So I mean, I'm just saying, pick one of those and figure out who the heck they are.
Yeah.
But after you figure out who they are, then decide what you're going to do to hold those people accountable.
Yeah.
If you've never been to a school board meeting, maybe go to one. Just them seeing a full room makes people act differently. Go to the county commission meeting, right? Go to the mayor's breakfast. Whatever is the thing in which you show up as a citizen to hold people accountable, it's not just the vote. That's why they do whatever they want after you vote for them, because you never show up again to make them accountable to what they said they were going to do or to what you want them to do.
Yeah.
So I'm asking you also to see it differently this time. We are in trouble. This country is in trouble. And the reason we're in trouble is because we have abdicated our own power. We have turned something that is precious, that people around the world die for, and that people in this country died for, into a ceremonial act that we can do or not do. And we put a little tag and a sticker on. And whether we did it intelligently, whether we do it in every election, whether we voted all the races down ballot, we still come out and say, I voted, and then we scold young people that they should register and vote. You don't even vote in all the elections. And it's time out for that, because that power we leave on the table is being snatched by people who don't believe in equality and justice. And it's time for us to take it back. So that's what we can do. We're also going to have an app this summer where you'll be able to download it and you'll be able to report voter suppression that you see happening. You might have seen in Chatham County, Georgia last week, the Confederate flags outside the early voting place. You might find out the polling places have been changed, on a dime. Whatever you find that you see, long lines, we want you to tell us. On election day, we'll be out. We'll be in Texas. You can tweet at us and tell us this is what's going on at this poll. Take pictures outside the polling place. Don't take them inside the polling place. But let us know what's going on. 866 Our Vote. Let's all the civil rights organizations know what's going on, and one of us will be able to troubleshoot it. But you've got to become active citizens, not just citizens, not just voters, but active citizens and voters. Let's fight for this democracy as the people who came before us fought.
Great. So we're gonna do. Yeah, we've got time for questions right here, and then Dean Dorn and Z. Yeah, can you tell us your name too?
Thank you for speaking to us this evening. My name is Anthony Collier, and I'm a 1L here at UT Law. So my question is, while you were in law school, what classes did you take, and what summer jobs did you work to put you in the position that
I love it.
that you're in now, and what classes and jobs do you recommend we take to better contribute to this movement?
Okay, great question. I'll be fast. So I knew I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer from the time I was in elementary school. So I loved law school because I wasn't trying to figure it out. I knew why I was there. NYU was a great law school because they have such a strong, powerful public interest program. And so that's kind of the coin of the realm. So that was great. I ended up teaching civil procedure for 20 years because I loved it. I loved it in law school. I did not know what the professor was talking about, Sam S. Stryker, for the first few weeks of class. When I say I didn't know what he was talking about, I mean I had no idea what he was talking about. Um, I remember the first conversation was about personal jurisdiction. I understood jurisdiction to be like a territory. I didn't know what minimum contacts meant. I didn't understand any of that. And then one day I read a little case that they don't teach anymore called Gray versus American Radiator. And the light bulb went on. And I became a civil procedure star. Like that was it. I became a teaching assistant and I loved it. I recommend that you get your hands around civil procedure if you want to be a litigator because mastering the rules of the game is key. Right, you got the substantive law, but you can't get there unless you can. If you can't overcome a motion to dismiss, if you can't overcome a summary judgment motion, you never get to trial. So your dreams that you're going to be in court doing something aren't going to happen unless you know how to master those rules. So civil procedure, pay close attention, take complex litigation courses, get those litigation courses under your belt. Lastly, I'd say take everything. Um, Here's why. I remember when I went to NYU Law School, that was the first year that you no longer were required to take tax law. And I was like, yes, fantastic. So I didn't take it. And then the first time that I had to negotiate a settlement on behalf of a client who wanted to know what the tax implications of that settlement would be in that civil rights case, I didn't have a clue, right? And I had to get, consultation. So all of this helps you because as a civil rights lawyer, you want to understand how power is held and created. Your job is to understand the architecture of injustice. And that means you have to understand how power works. So corporations is really important. You need to understand it. So to the extent you're tacking yourself only towards civil rights courses, that is a mistake. Your job is to understand power on behalf of your clients. So just throw yourself in there wholeheartedly. Summer jobs, I worked the first summer. I was a summer clerk for a great hero, uh, Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, who was an
Oh yes,
African American
Judge
judge on the
Higginbotham.
Third
Yeah,
Circuit Court of
absolutely.
Appeals. And the second summer, I went to Europe and worked at the UN Center for Human Rights.
Man, it's too much. Okay, Dean Dorn.
Hi, thanks
I
very much for being here. Where are future Sherrilyn Ifills coming from? That is
Queens.
one of the great
Queens, New York.
things.
Queens.
You mentioned some of
Don't
the
spell Ifill.
heroes of the
Mhm,
LDF: Charles Hamilton Houston,
mhm,
Thurgood Marshall, and so on. And there was a core of people at uh, sort of a nascent Howard Law School
mhm,
who developed the strategy that
mhm,
led to so many of those
mhm,
victories.
mhm,
Are there things like that now?
mhm.
And where are they?
So the first thing I would say is that LDF is like, this is going to sound terrible, but it's, I've been lately thinking that we're like the McKinsey of civil rights lawyers. In that, if you look at many of the leaders of civil rights organizations who are a generation younger than me, they all came through LDF.
Mhm.
The head of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, Vanita Gupta, was at LDF when she litigated and the cases on behalf of the Tulia folks who were being
Yeah,
railroaded in Tulia,
yeah,
Texas.
yeah.
That's the woman who's now leading the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Kristen Clark, who leads the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, was an LDF lawyer. If you start going through these organizations, you find that people did a stint at LDF. It's almost become like a little bit of a, it's not even a finishing school, but um, most of the people who are out there doing tremendous civil rights lawyering, the young man who runs Civil Rights Corps that's doing the great bail reform work,
Mhm.
Alex, I can't forget his last name, they've all been interns or lawyers or so frankly, we're playing a really an important role of training. Judy Brown Dianis, who runs the Advancement Project, was an LDF lawyer and led our Los Angeles office. So LDF is playing that role quite powerfully. We also have a scholarship program, and so we try to feed into law students. We used to give a lot of students a little bit of money, and when I came aboard to be director counsel, I changed that and we gave more money to fewer students to try to really influence them in a way that would encourage them to move towards civil rights law. And then I do a lot of this. I try to speak actually at law schools to answer questions like that and to encourage people to become civil rights lawyers. People, I think, don't realize that LDF is a young person's game.
Mm.
I was at LDF from age 25 to 30 when I left. Most of our lawyers are in their 30s. just as Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley were when they were young lawyers in LDF. And I think people forget because it's such a legacy organization and because the leader is, shall we say, older. But actually, if you're in our office, it's just filled with these incredible young lawyers. Most of the lawyers have children under the age of 5 in the office. I left when my daughter was 3. So it's really a space of just young people doing extraordinary work.
Okay, Z.
Hi, Azim Edwin. I'm a student here at LBJ. How do you feel about the prison abolition movement?
Well, I'm not an abolitionist at this point because always need to know what the alternative is and what the plan is. I'm actually quite encouraging of people who are recognizing this as a moment when we should be radically reimagining public safety.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not wedded to abolition, but I do think that this is the moment in which we should be thinking about reimagining what public safety would look like. So for me, I try to reimagine a public safety apparatus in our communities that looks very different than the one that we have now. I don't say abolish the police. I just think the police should be doing much fewer things than they are currently doing, right? So if you have, if you're in your home and there's a noise complaint or there are kids outside playing around your car and you shout out the window, you say, hey, y'all need to, it's midnight, and they cuss back up at you, do you call 911? Well, I think too many people do.
Yes.
There should be actually a youth corps of people who are part of the public safety apparatus of a community who know how to engage with young people and who know how to and who are trusted by them. And you call that, you call 311 when it's a non-emergency. It should be 711, and 711 the youth corps comes. When your child is having a mental health crisis and you're frightened that they may harm you or themselves, but you know that they just need something to bring them down to they can get to a facility or get their meds, there should be a mental health corps that is part of the public safety apparatus of your city that you can call, who comes with their special training to be able to deal. There need to be, and these are jobs we could be creating in our community so that people from the community can be part of this, right? Who can be the youth mediators and who can be the mental health workers and so forth. The problem is now we call the police for everything.
Yes.
And so I do think that we should be reimagining what public safety looks like. And so I can't deny, and I would like to hear more about what is the alternative, what we're imagining that if you abolished prison, what would happen? Because there are people who need to be incapacitated for periods of time because they have committed violent crimes against the community, right?
But I think in that context, in terms of prison abolition, it's what you talked about at the start of your talk: investment. So what are we investing in?
Well,
I think
so that's a what do you call it? A runway, right?
Yeah.
So if you were on that runway, you'd be always trying to stop the front end. You wouldn't just say today we would close all the prisons, right? You would try to make prison more humane so that people were not being driven insane by being incarcerated. You would be creating programs that allow people to come out and live decent lives. You would be treating them as true citizens when they came out. But most of all, you would deal with that pathway in.
Yeah.
And you would be making so that you're looking at a moment in the future in which you are then closing prisons because you don't need it, because you are actually providing the services that people need. And you are not using incarceration as a way of ignoring these very difficult other issues that have to be dealt with, that could be dealt with on the front end.
Yeah. Let's do one more.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Sharman. I'm an alumnus of this fine institution and had the honor of taking Barbara Jordan's class when I was here. I also was the chief map drawer for Texas in the 1990s. Ultimately, my congressional maps fell to Shaw v. Reno and were branded as racial gerrymanders. But I, in that context, I wonder, have single member districts run out of the runway in terms of empowering minority voices when there are other voting systems that do it without drawing lines on a map?
Look, I mean, the first case I ever filed as an LDF lawyer was a case called Houston Lawyers Association versus Attorney General of Texas, and it was a case challenging the way judges are elected in Harris County. And the remedy we sought was single member districts or cumulative or limited voting, right? No lines. We won at the trial court level. We went on appeal. We won in the Supreme Court. The judicial elections are covered by the Voting Rights Act. We came back And, the Court of Appeals was like, you can't draw these districts because these are trial court judges, and that's the end. And these other alternatives, cumulative and limited vote, are too speculative and too whatever, right? So, but we just settled a case in Alabama in which the remedy that we settled for is cumulative voting. It's really exciting. We were like, are they sure? Because so it's a question, but it's also a question of what are we doing in those single member districts, and what are we demanding? When we talk about political power, um, what are we demanding of people in those districts, and what is that power supposed to look like? It's also a function of segregation.
Yeah.
So we also have to think about what that means to basically be acquiescing to that. Um, so it's going to be difficult with this redistricting round to do a lot of innovation, because I'm not even sure how well we're going to get the census count, and that's the other thing that you all should do. Is you must encourage people to participate in the census.
Yes.
And so without the right count, all of this is academic.
All right, I'm gonna let you have the
Oh.
final word.
The final
here.
word.
Yeah.
I think it just goes back to what both you and I were suggesting earlier. I'm very disappointed in where we are in this country right now. I mean, I think that's the right word. I'm disappointed. I thought hoped we were better than this. But I really recognize the importance of the work, that no gains or wins are permanent, that you have to, there always is the loop back. And I'm not at all discouraged, because I actually think, Martin Luther King talked about the need to surface the tension. He said, what you're seeing right now, when you see these violent clashes, we're not creating the tension, we're surfacing the tension that already existed.
Yeah.
And so I feel certainly that at this moment in this country, the tension that was below the surface for many people has been surfaced. We see what we may have refused to see before.
Yep.
And that's the beginning of change, right? That's the beginning of change, when it's fully exposed, when you can't deny it, right? That's the beginning of change. But it's only the beginning. And it's so incumbent upon us to summon the courage within ourselves to meet this moment. We are a spoiled generation. Most of us in this room were probably born after World War II, right?
Yeah.
And so we grew up and lived in this world in which it looked like it was only heading in one direction. And we took for granted that we would have to do the work of moving it. So who are we to think that we should be spared the struggle and the work that our forebears had to do so that we could have the lives that we have, and so that we could look so beautiful and diverse sitting in this room in a way that would have been impossible. When I give speeches all the time, I do this exercise in which I usually have for people an example of what they would have had to go through on the way to getting to the auditorium if it was 1950. So it's not that long ago, and we've largely been beneficiaries. And now it's time for us to do the work.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to just do just a bit of housekeeping. I just want to thank the CSRD team, Emily Dunkley, our program coordinator, Barbara Kufiadin, Amanda Clark, Maddie Donham, Janelle Ajani, and really all the team of volunteers. We have extraordinary students here at the University of Texas and the LBJ School, both undergraduate and graduate, who are hugely committed to social justice. They really believe in what Sherrilyn Ifill, President Ifill, was talking about. They're emotionally intelligent, besides just being brilliant in other ways. And you need that empathy right now more than ever. I agree with what Sherrilyn said about the equity dividend. And in a way, we've sort of wasted that equity dividend on a politics of punishment, but also on a politics of being disconnected from each other. We need even those of us who think of ourselves as progressive, we have to walk the talk in our regular lives. And it doesn't mean that we're not imperfect. We're all imperfect. But I find myself at 47 and as a father of really three, crying much more often, not because anybody has done anything bad to me, but because I feel so deeply the issues that I organize and struggle and write and study about. So I implore everybody in this room to really connect with each other. We have to think and have radical empathy. We have to lead with vulnerability, with love, with compassion, with forgiveness. For all of our flaws, we really do think of this country, and my colleague and friend Jeremy Suri has a terrific book called Liberty's Surest Guardian, as a place where all things are possible. That's not how we feel right now, but I actually do believe it. And the only way you can get up in the morning, have children, take care of people is to believe that things are going to change and that we can do something radically transformative to the current status quo. So for all of us who really believe in small d democracy, we believe in human rights, we believe that we see difference, but difference doesn't have to be negative. And we also believe that citizenship, like Dr. King said, wasn't just about removing structures of oppression, it was about having guaranteed resources so that we could thrive. We all want to thrive. We have our children here, our grandchildren, our parents. We want them to have the best life that they can have, and we should think equitably about that. The way in which you want your children to thrive, we should think about creating networks and communities where we can all thrive and we can have that moral clarity, not just political and economic resources, but moral clarity. The whole idea of the civil rights movement being the moral struggle of our time, and movements against racism, against anti-Semitism, against gender inequality and sexism and transphobia and homophobia, Islamophobia. That's the calling, the moral calling of our time. And I want to applaud Sherrilyn Ifill for really devoting her life to this struggle. So thank you. Next week, as part of our William C. Powers series, we have Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. is going to be here at the Blanton. And on April 2nd, we have our Social Entrepreneurship, Social Justice Conference. April 8th, The Sword and the Shield, what is that? Yours truly has a new book coming out. And on May 5th, we have the CSRD Student Fellow Symposium. So for all the center's supporters, I thank you so much. We are building something powerful and special here, a community of social justice advocates who are interested in changing the world. Thank you.